Now to what is a heartbreaking and devastating loss for any parent. Stillbirth is when a baby dies before or during birth. And Stillbirth Foundation Australia estimates there are 6 stillborn babies every day in Australia, which is more than 2,000 every year. Well, last week, new Senator Kristina Keneally made her first address to the Senate and co-sponsored an inquiry into stillbirth as she paid tribute to the tiny daughter she lost.
Our daughter Caroline never drew breath, but she changed me forever. She enlarged my understanding of love and loss. She taught me to survive. She made me brave, almost fearless.
Let's welcome to Studio 10 Senator Kristina Keneally. Kristina, thank you so much for joining us. This is such an important story because I know stillbirth affects so many parents, but I had no idea that there are 6 stillborn babies born every day. Why don't we hear more about it?
I think partly we view this as a private tragedy rather than a public health problem. Partly it is incredibly painful to talk about. And I think for parents who have gone through it, it is incredibly awful. It is a terrible thing to happen. It took me about 10 years before I could talk about it in public without breaking down. And I think for other parents, and I understand this completely, it is such an awful thing to contemplate that you almost want to avoid having to engage with what is an awful, terrible grief. And you feel a sense of relief that your child was born safely. But 6 babies a day means that almost every one of us will know someone or have someone in our family who's been touched by this. It is a terrible tragedy, but it is also a significant public health problem. Surely we can do better as a country than losing 6 babies every day.
We were talking about this in hair and makeup earlier this morning. Is there a connection between stillbirth and SIDS?
There isn't in many ways, except in one important one. SIDS, of course, is when a child dies after they've been born. It's often known as cot death. And it is as far as we know, quite a different issue. The key link I would make here, though, is that it was Australian research into SIDS that led to the Back to Sleep campaign. And now the Back to Sleep campaign has seen the rate of sudden infant death syndrome drop by 85%. So for every baby who dies of cot death or SIDS, 35 are stillborn. And what that says to me is that with research and focus and a willingness to acknowledge the problem, talk about it, and put money into research, we can reduce babies' deaths. Now, we've done that with SIDS. Now, every baby who dies of SIDS still, of course, is a desperate loss for their parents. But we have seen hundreds of babies' lives saved. And we can do the same, I believe, with stillbirth if we actually put that effort into it.
So, KK, what are the main causes of stillbirth? And I've known a couple of people, and it is just the most horrible thing to happen. And what can we actually do? How much can you actually do to stop it from happening? Is it something we can sort of fix?
Well, there's a lot of things we don't know about stillbirth that we could if we had some research. Now, there are things that would affect any pregnancy in terms of health, smoking, lifestyle, etc., and that we give that advice to parents. But there are a lot of things we don't advise parents that we could be telling them. Right. For example, there's some evidence that would suggest that if mothers sleep on their side rather than on their back, they can reduce the likelihood of stillbirth.
Really?
Gosh. Yeah, and this is information right now that the Stillbirth Foundation is trying to get out into the community. So there are things that we know that we're not telling parents. And then there are things that we could know if we did more research. And let me just give you one example. We're not very good as a nation at getting autopsies done.
Yes.
And this is a terribly...
Is it cost or why?
No, I think it's got a lot to do with the
family.
It's hard to talk to parents in this circumstance, and we need to send in trained senior clinicians that would explain it's not just a benefit to that family and that baby, it's also a benefit to their future children. In my circumstance, I lost my daughter Caroline, and we did have an autopsy done, and it did give us very useful information to help prevent a stillbirth with my subsequent child. Wow. And so it's that type of advice, but we're not collecting enough data on these babies. We're not collecting enough data on the pregnancy. So if you think about right now, we have more capacity than we've ever had in human history to collect real-time data on pregnant mothers. Think about your Fitbits and your Google Watches and the things that we could actually be using innovation to get real-time data to tell us what's happening in a pregnancy that would help us understand what some of the causes are. But even so, right now, about 50% of stillbirths will be unexplained. And that's because we're not getting data in a timely manner, in a useful manner, and in a way that helps our researchers.
And also, as you said before, women are keeping quiet, families are keeping quiet, mainly because of the shock. Trauma. Just like SIDS, like there's a shock element to it. So, again, you've got a back-end problem of where do they go to? What facilities are available?
In a way, you've got to give them permission to talk about it. I mean, it would be very difficult. I can appreciate that it would take you 10 years to be able to talk about it without breaking down.
But there's going to be a consequence to that too. Like, there's going to be a massive mental consequence to that. You know, after a woman has a stillborn, are there places she can go?
Yeah.
Like,
so
what infrastructure's around?
There is actually very good infrastructure, and it's one thing we've done much better than we used to do generations and decades ago, is help parents recover. But still, if you think about the experience of being the mother of a stillborn child, you're constantly going to get questions. How many children do you have? Do you have boys or girls? I have 2 boys, and I used to get, don't you want to try for a girl? Yes. And, I have made a decision to, name myself as the mother of 3 children because it actually helps break down that stigma. And I now know so many mothers of stillborn children who have decided, they say, I have this many children, and their names are. And so my advice to people to help others know how to talk about it is to, if you know someone who's had a stillborn child, ask them about the child's name. Mention them. Try to remember when the birthday is. That person is a part of their family. And that acknowledgement helps.
You're back in politics in the Senate, which is, copped a lot of flack in recent time because of the unusual makeup of the Senate, the Senate that we have in Australia. But in the Senate, this is where you're calling for an inquiry. This is where the Senate really comes into its own, isn't it?
You're right.
So what are you hoping the Senate inquiry into stillbirth might achieve?
Well, Senate inquiries are a very good way to shed some light on a subject and also get to some recommendations that government can implement. Can I say right up front, Minister Greg Hunt and the Liberal Party have been very supportive. Labor's been very supportive, and the crossbench. So
we have
great.
A bipartisan approach.
We have a bipartisan approach, which is fantastic. What I would like to achieve is really 3 things. 1, a more timely and consistent and usable set of data collected across all the states and territories. 2, a sustainable form of funding. Right now, most of the funding for stillbirth research comes from parents of stillborn children and their family and friends. So corporate sector and government support for sustainable research. And then thirdly, a clear understanding of the economic impact of stillbirth. 6 babies a day dying has an impact on their parents, on their ability to go to work, on the health system, on childcare for their other children. There is a big economic impact here, and if we're measuring it, we can understand investment in prevention and research could actually lead to improvement in the economy as well as a massive improvement in the lives of those families.
It sounds like what we need is a similar campaign to the one we had recently about organ donation and sort of taking all the stigma away, taking the shock factor away, so it's not just when you've just lost someone that you're hearing about your options for the first time, but that there's a sort of established public infrastructure in place, a procedure in place. They say, right, this is what's happened, this is awful, and now we need the chance to potentially help someone else to stop it from happening to them.
Well, one thing I'd like to ask you, if it's not upsetting, but when a baby is stillborn, the baby is quite perfect to look at, isn't that right?
It is, and this is the thing. Many parents of stillborn children, they will spend time in the hospital holding their child, singing to them, selecting clothes for the funeral, and just for viewers to understand if they're not familiar with it. When you have a stillborn child, you go through every aspect of birth, labour, contractions, delivery.
You become a mother.
You become a mother. And you give birth to a child who is not alive. And then you have to make all of the decisions about funerals and autopsies and all the decisions people make when someone has died. So a time which is usually of great joy in a maternity ward, which is a place of great happiness, you're going through extreme sorrow and grief. But yes, stillborn children are often now photographed.
Yes.
My daughter also had her hand and her feet prints, which we have up in our home. She is buried in a nearby cemetery. I visit her grave once a month. She's a part of our family, and I think for many parents, a great deal of healing has come from that.
Yes.
I know in my mother's generation, if a child was stillborn, often women were sent home without seeing the baby and told to forget about
and
it.
the baby was taken away and they didn't have a time to grieve. Kristina, if there's anyone at home, because I think you've done such wonderful work about the awareness of it, if someone's at home watching and they want to know about support groups or how they can help with the data situation, where can they go?
Well, I would suggest 2 places. One, for research and donations, go to Stillbirth Foundation Australia. And if you are yourself struggling or know someone who is, you can either go to SIDS and Kids, who do a great deal of work around counselling, or SANS, which is another resource, or contact your local doctor who can put you in touch with social workers and other professionals.
Kristina, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your story, and good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good,